Hi, my name's Hayden, and today we're going to be talking about Cascading Style Sheets, or what you may have more often heard as CSS. Now, CSS is, in a nutshell, the way we make web pages look nice. It's the styling, it's the aesthetic, it's the color, it's the layout. It's what really makes them pop, and it's what really contrasts them to that kind of old school web like we talked about with Wikipedia, where everything's just blocks of text and a couple of images. Before we get into some of the theory behind CSS and some of the high level rules, we're first just going to do a really simple example of what it even is. Because if you haven't seen it before, understanding how it ties into what we've been doing with HTML is really important. So the probably starting point here is that CSS is kind of built on top of HTML. That's not to say it's the same language or anything, but you don't really go and build a website with CSS and not HTML. It's kind of like HTML is the base of everything, and then CSS is like an add-on. It's like an enhancement, an extension, if you will. And that makes sense because it was kind of brought into the world after HTML existed. Now, this is a fairly simple HTML file that we've seen before. And we've seen previously that we can do some interesting things, like we kind of gave our table some borders and we made some dot points, but sometimes we might want to do something a little bit more fun, such as increase the font size of some text. So I mentioned before that a span is an HTML tag that has, essentially, it's a styleless tag. It's like a blank canvas, a total template. Before CSS was kind of invented, we used to style our HTML tags by actual built-in attributes and values that existed on the tags. So you used to do something like this. You used to say span color equals red, and that will color the text of the span. Now, that's all well and good. Nothing wrong with that at all. It kind of works. It kind of behaves fine. But CSS is done slightly differently. What you do with CSS is that all CSS is defined inside of these double quotes when it comes to the style attribute. So pretty much every single HTML element has a style attribute, and inside of that you put some CSS. So like CSS goes here. So all dumped there. And CSS is a language basically made up of key value pairs that we're going to go through together. But if I wanted to make this text, for instance, red, I would go color is red, like this. And now when I go and open up my page, and remember we can just open up our page by dragging our file straight into the web browser, you'll see here that I now have some text that is hi. It's just red text that says hi. And I could change this from color red to color blue if I want to, like this. And you can see that CSS is made up of, again, these key value pairs. So this is a key, this is a value. We'll talk more about that in a second, but that's it. You just apply these styles to lots of HTML elements. So we saw things like lists, we saw things like headers, paragraphs, these styleless tags. You can apply CSS to all of it. Now, there are two primary ways that you can include CSS in your web page. The first one is to do exactly what we've just done there, where we create some kind of element, in this case a div. We did a span where you put the CSS between the style as a style attribute. But the other way to do things, which is slightly more common and what you'll be doing in your assignments, is that you actually import CSS from another file. And we can do that together, where you can see here I've got this file here called stuff.css. And what I do is I take my color blue, I go into my stuff.css file here, but I need to kind of give this set of styles some kind of name. So I might call this, say, blue text, like this. And then I define my CSS inside of these curly braces. You can see the example on the lecture slide just up here. Obviously the color's red. And I put a dot in front of my property, and that's kind of it. That's all I really have to do there. And now if I want to kind of apply that style to my page, instead of explicitly writing style equals color blue, I actually say class equals blue text. So class is what we use when we want to say, I have a name that describes styles and I want you to apply that name. It's kind of like, you know, a function, a rule, a variable name, whatever. It's an abstraction. And style is what we use when we're actually writing the CSS in line. It's what we call inline CSS. Now, you will see that when I do this, suddenly the text is now black again. And the reason for that is because this HTML file does not inherently understand what blue text is. It's just like, I don't know what that is. So if we go back to our slides, you'll see that if you want to import something, in particular CSS, onto your page, you actually have to add this link rel style sheet href style.css. Now, this is actually a good example of something we put inside the head tag. So here I'll say link, what was it, link type, link rel equals style sheet. You just do what you're told, and then the href is stuff.css. It's the name of your file, and there's our header there. Now, because that CSS was kind of like copied into my file, think of that again like a hash include or something similar. That blue text now works. And if I come over here and change that text from color blue to red, which is very silly given that the name of that class is blue text, it will now change to red. But let's keep that as blue for the moment. So there are a couple of basic ways that you can interact with CSS. And then the third way is that you can actually take your CSS. You don't need to import it, but you can actually just write this directly into your page. You can create, there's a style tag in HTML, and anything in that style tag, the web browser will treat like CSS and process it like CSS. So generally speaking, we've got these three tiers. We've got our inline styles that we did first, and then on the other end, we've got these like external styles where they're defined in another file. And then we have kind of a middle ground that's the styles defined still separately to your HTML, but in the same HTML file. Now, before we move on, there's like a pretty common question, which is like, which one do I use? What should I use? Now, as a general rule, what I would say is that it's always better to externalize your styles, put them in another file. The one scenario that it probably is good to inline them is when you're kind of hacking or coding or like developing, because you know, sometimes if you're trying to make a page look a certain way or you're playing around, it's much easier just to come here and put a quick style in that says, you know, font size is 200%, as in twice the normal size. Sometimes that's a lot easier than kind of looking at the class and then trying to remember what file it's in and then finding it, then adding it here. And then sometimes that applies to like other things that are using that style. So that's probably the only time it's worth doing inline styles is like early development. Like it's a good way to play around. Don't put pressure on yourself to go and perfectly organize all of your code into external style sheets. But generally we do like to put everything in external style sheets. So we like to do this here. Now, there's a few benefits of them being externalized. Well, one of the benefits is that you can reuse things. Now, this isn't necessarily about being external. This is more about separating out into classes. But one of the other benefits that's a little bit more technical is that what your web browser actually does is that when it loads a page, often web pages include all these different elements. So if you load a website like unsw.edu.au, it will actually be going and including all these different CSS files all over the place. And what web browsers do is they will cache those files. They will store a local copy of those files and they won't ask for a new one for maybe a couple of days or a week or a few hours, depends how it's configured. And this is good because it speeds up a website. That's why you'll notice if I go to a website like unsw.edu.au, the first time the page loads, it can often be a little bit slower. Now I'm doing like a hard refresh here, like a full refresh. You notice it takes like a second to load, but when I just do a normal refresh, it's not much different, but you can kind of see it. Yeah, it's a little slower, right? So normal refresh really quick, and then a full refresh takes that extra like second. And that's because that full refresh is forcing all the new CSS, well, all the external CSS to come in, slows it down. So there's lots of benefits to it. So generally it's like externalize it unless you're kind of hacking away as a general. So cool, we've got our little highs here. As I said in the HTML lecture, if you make them divs, everything becomes like their own block, which is really important. If you're confused about that, there are other lectures about layout in particular with HTML and CSS. But that's like the gist of how to import CSS. But it's kind of boring. Let's get into what you can do with CSS. So everything in CSS, in terms of the definitions, and this is no longer talking about inline styles. We're all talking about how to like define it separately. It's all made up of selectors and then property value pairs. So a selector is simply a way of describing where it applies, right? Define the elements to which the rule applies, and then property and value are just key value pairs. Now, you've seen this demonstrated here, where this up here is the selector. This is the class name that it applies to. And then here I can go and add my, font weight, my color blue, like this. Font weight, my bad. Font size, just wondering why that wasn't working. Yeah, so I've got my font size. So you can see there, everything's made up of these key value pairs all inside of a selector. And your file can have many selectors. You could come down here and you could make some red text, for instance. That is font size 200 and color red. And we could make the second two here red text, like that. And you'll see that it's broken up that way. So everything in CSS, selectors, property values. Now in this way, this kind of actually makes CSS probably one of the simplest things you'll ever program, and it probably doesn't even feel like programming, which makes sense. It's a markup language that is remarkably straightforward. Now there are rules to it, which is what this lecture is about, but structurally, that's CSS. You've learned the structure of CSS. Move on. So next thing is we're going to start learning about selectors. And that's most of what this lecture is about. It's about these rules that apply. And then in future lectures, we learn about more properties in terms of formatting and in terms of layout. So lots and lots of selectors. So firstly, we have a universal selector. This is where you use a star. And what this means is that it applies to all elements on the page. So for instance, let's say I have my web page here and I would like to have all of my text. You know, maybe I have some text down here like, how are you? How do I get all of the text on this page, for instance, to be font size 200? Well, I simply use the star. That's the universal selector. Now, because I've gone and put it there, I don't need to go and put it anywhere else if I don't want to. You can see my page there because it's applying it to everything. And similarly, if I made this, color orange, you'll see that the text is now orange. Now we'll come back to why not everything's orange later. It's probably pretty obvious to you, but that's a bit of a later topic. But that's the universal selector. It's pretty simple. When do you use that? Not really very often. Most of the time it's to do with text, I'd say, because sometimes you want to apply the same kind of basic font size or the same kind of like font generally, like Arial or Times New Roman, to everything on a web page. But generally it's not super common. Another way that that's used is not actually through the star, but through like the body tag. This one is slightly different. This one just says that it applies it to the outermost tag here, body, which doesn't always have the results you'd expect, as you can see. So that's why the universal selector is a bit more useful when you want it to apply to everything, because when you say the body tag, you're essentially saying you want the outermost tag to have a property, whereas the universal selector is saying I want everything to have a property. But again, you don't really need to worry about it because it's not super commonly used. Another way that you can use selectors is through the type selector. So we're kind of going through levels of specificity here. The type selector is where you don't actually kind of give it a name. Like here, we've kind of created these class names as examples, but you actually just refer to a particular tag. So in this case, like a div. So maybe we'll do something else like a link. Like let's say we have a link to Google. So say we've got our link to Google here. Google, like that. Refresh the page. There's my Google link. We'll put a BR there just to break that up a little bit. Google link's very big. And you know what? I want all my anchor tags, all of my link tags to actually, what can we make them do that isn't too fancy? Well, let's make all of them yellow. That's a terrible idea. But now all of our links are yellow. You see here, I haven't had to kind of give it a style name. I haven't had to give it a class, but I've used the tag selector. Tag selectors are really useful, particularly for things that maybe like paragraph tags. So really commonly for text or images, if you want every image to kind of have maybe a border around it. I most often see them used for things like unordered list, headers. Headers are a really common way, because sometimes you want your header to be like really big or, really small or something like that. But that's a tag selector. Pretty fun. Class selector. This is the one that we kind of demoed with at the start here. It's really just a way of naming a set of styles. It's kind of the classic way to do that. So, it's exactly what we've done here. .blue text, .red text. The dot refers to class. If I just write blue text, the web browser, the way the engine works is it will try and look for a tag called blue text. That's why we need the dot, because, the A tag and the H1 tag, the P tag. So the dot is our way of saying this is not a tag, this is a class, and a class is just a name, right? So this is a name for a set of properties to apply, and then you simply apply them doing what we've done, where you pick a particular element and you say that this element's attribute class is equal to this value, and then the browser knows to go look it up here. So that one's pretty straightforward. We already looked at that. One that's paired with that pretty commonly is the ID selector. The ID selector looks very similar and it behaves super similar in the sense that here I could create another one called green text with color green, but instead of the dot, we simply use a hash. Now that difference between a dot and a hash is very, very slight, but the way that then changes how we use it is that we now say div ID equals green text. So the star, not the star, the hash means ID. So dot means class, hash means ID. That's how we apply these styles to the page. Now, what's the difference between these? Basically, an ID should generally be used if your element only exists once, and a class should be used if it may exist many times on the page. So ID is single, class is multiple. It's probably very common from a programming standpoint to just make everything classes, and maybe something's an ID. So don't kind of feel like you have to ask yourself constantly, should this be a class? Should this be an ID? Just using a class is fine. So, but IDs are kind of useful for instance things like, let's say I later on go and create a div called like a header block or something like this, and that header block, it only exists once because there's only one header block on the page. That's probably an example where I might give it an ID like that. And then I'll come here and say, the header block is going to have a certain style here, like that. This kind of also feeds into another point, which might come up later, but just while I'm here, is that generally when it comes to the naming conventions of our CSS styles, we use dashes. We don't use camel case. We don't use snake case with underscores, we use dashes. So that's header block. So you could argue a lot of these should probably be like, just to make things a little bit cleaner, like blue text like this. So that's probably more appropriate. So that kind of dash syntax is very common. Yeah. So that's an ID selector. Now that's most of the base. 95% of everything you do is going to be class and ID selectors. And then 4% of what you're going to do is probably going to be tag selectors, right? So we've really covered the bulk of things now. A lot of what we're going to continue talking about is often the more obscure things in CSS. And they're really cool, and they certainly have some uses. So the next one's the attribute selector. This one's kind of, attribute selectors can often feel like tag selectors depending on their context. And let's say, for instance, we have a couple of radio buttons, like this. We don't need to do more than that, but obviously, if you want to style these radio buttons, maybe you want to make them a certain size. So I've got my two, well, they're very small, aren't they? So I might put them up the top where we can see them a bit better. So let's say I've got my two little radio buttons here, and I'll separate them out. Now, they're quite tiny. Let's say I want to make them really big. Well, I could come along and say, like, my radio button is going to be, let's try again, font size 200%. And then I could here say, well, these are going to have a class of my radio. And now they should be super big. Well, not super big. I'm not sure how to make these big, actually. Let's Google it. Radio button size CSS. Right, lots of things we don't know. How do I change the size of my radio button? This is a really common thing you'll be doing. Okay, width and height. Okay, so radio button has a certain width and a certain height. So instead of using font size, that was just my assumption. Let's say that its width should be 100 pixels. Okay, now that wasn't too useful. That just kind of made the area bigger. That's okay. We can move on from that. Good example of where you go and Google stuff. Let's say we create that width of 100 pixels here. You can see it's changed the hit area. This is kind of really important. Notice I'm not clicking on it. So the actual width of the element's much larger, even though the circle itself is quite different. So these are all these kinds of subtleties that you pick up on as you play with things. As you think, okay, well, font size did nothing, which makes sense because it's a radio, not some text. The width didn't increase the size of the little icon-y thing, the radio button, but it increased the size of the area, for instance. And similarly, if I made this height 100 pixels too. Oh, there you go. There's the answer. So what was clearly happening there was without the height, the size of the radio was like a really thin rectangle, right? And Therefore, that little circle, which always wants to be a circle, couldn't really get any taller. But the second we increased the height, the circle just kind of expanded out to fill the space, right? Now, I've never made a radio button that big, so I just learned something too, right? This is the fun of CSS. There's so much you learn. It's not like learning C or these other languages where you just kind of learn everything and then you solve hard problems, right? There's so much to learn and tons of things you'll never, ever, ever use. Super fun. So there's our two radio buttons. But let's say I don't want to have to use a class here because I want to, maybe I know that this is going to apply to every single radio button in my website. So I don't want to have to put classes everywhere. But I don't want to just say that my inputs should be this big because that'll totally ruin things if I say you need to come along and make a text input. Because now my text input's going to look like it's square. Stupid, right? Absolutely dumb. So what I can do instead is I can do an attribute selector where it's a tag selector with some extra stuff, which in this case will be if my type equals radio. So you essentially go and you put the HTML attribute value pair inside of these square brackets after the tag selector, and now this only applies to a particular subset of things. There's a few cool tutorial questions we have where we demonstrate some examples of that, but that's the gist of the mechanics. That's the attribute selector, kind of cute. These ones are the combinators are ways of applying CSS rules, because again, these are all about the selectors of CSS, right? We're not talking about the properties and stuff. Combinators are those things that you can totally avoid. You don't need to know them. You can kind of solve every problem without them. But if you learn how to use them, you will start being able to code far more concisely and more powerfully and easily, right? So you can see here, we've got this little series of divs and spans, right? Div class equals A, and then spans and divs like this. Now, I'm going to quickly write this up because I can't copy from the slides here. And then we'll kind of take you through these different combinators that make styling these in intricate ways very easy. So if you do have these kinds of divs and spans, sometimes you want to be able to specify things a little bit more specifically, such as I want all of the B classes inside of the A classes to have a certain style, or I want all of the divs inside of the divs with a certain class to have a certain style. Now, this can be tags or the universal selector or classes or IDs. This isn't tied to one of them. This is kind of how you explain the relationship between them. So if you have a look here, for instance, the first one is if you put two things as a selector, say .a, .b. And what this says is that these styles apply to all elements with class B that are inside an element with class A. So if you have a look on the left here, look at all the elements with class B that are inside a class A. Well, that's one here, right? See this 5, 6, 4, 3, and 1. So now if we go and load our page, because I've got the code up here. Actually, sorry, I need to go and apply these styles, don't I? You know, everything, all the .b's inside of .a, let's say they're all color red. You can see we've got that there, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Now you can see that C here is the 2, that's black, so that's why that didn't apply. So that one's super helpful. Obviously you could do something like say, you're like, why do I need to do that? Why can't I just say everything with B is red? That worked fine. And the answer is because sometimes sometimes really common names you might use in multiple places. So for instance, let's say that you actually have your inputs be a class B as well. Maybe class B is a pseudonym for if you were to have a class that says like red or strong or primary or secondary or warning or danger, like these kinds of general words. And quite often you might have something like a class B that has a style everywhere, right? Quite often class B will have a style, but then you want to kind of add extra styles to all the B's inside of a certain area. So that is where we get these kinds of descendant ones from. Now, the child one is very similar, and in the sense that it's like not an inheritance thing. It's like a descendant thing, except the child one only applies to elements which are a direct child of A. So as we saw before, this top one, first one, color red, applied to all B's within an A. This one applies to only B's whose parent is an A, which means that this 5 here is out. Same with this, this 6 was never in because it didn't count. That's what we saw before, except my screen was a bit big, so it's hiding down here. So you'll see here, this is the original one. This is the original one, A and B. That's why 6 will go black. Makes sense. If I put this here, now they become the child one, which means that we lose 5 because 5 is not an immediate child. It's kind of tucked in between another div. The next one is adjacent sibling. So that's basically saying any B that follows immediately after a C. So this one is pretty obscure. I won't lie to you. I haven't ever used this true like for something real, more just for playing around. Oops, sorry, this is meant to be C plus B. So C plus B, let me see if I'll just split these by column. 2 rows. Beautiful. Just so you can see this a bit clearer. So this C plus B now, this means that only this 3 has that color, which makes sense because if we go back to the rules were that any B that is adjacent to a C. Pretty okay. And then the last one is general sibling, which is all siblings, all Bs that follow after a C in that kind of block. So in this case now that will make 3 and 4 color, I believe. We can try that out, right? So if we use the tilde here, now it's 3 and 4. Now obviously the B here does not apply because this span class B is not a sibling of C because it's like nested inside. And then similarly, the 6B here is not a sibling because it's nested outside. So a sibling is something in the same code block. It's not something in a deeper code block or an outer code block or anything like that. That's the combinators. Again, the top 2, super interesting. They're always ones that I'm like, I should use them more. So I'd encourage you to. These next 2 I have not found a ton of a use case for, but it gives you a sense of the kind of power of selectors of CSS. So keep an eye out for those. Now, more ways we can use selectors are pseudo-classes. Pseudo-classes are a way of applying properties to particular tags or classes or IDs when they're in a particular state. This is probably a new concept because mostly to a new state. And we'll apply those to a few elements. We can practice around with them. It also just reminds me that, you know, this example we did here, it includes a lot of stuff with classes, but things don't have to be classes, right? So for instance, let's say we take a look at something here where we say, you know what, all class Bs that are inside a class B or an immediate child. Oops, sorry, maybe let me do it a slightly different way. Yeah, all class Bs inside a class A, right? Now this will get us back to that red one we saw before. But they don't always have to be classes. They can sometimes just be tags as well. So for instance here, I don't have to say all class Bs within a class A. I can actually say all class Bs within a div. And this will apply normally too, but you'll see it will have a funny side effect because now this 5, which was previously not selected, is selected because you know, it's a immediate child of a div. Because in this case, there is no class B that's an immediate child of a class A because this div has no class. But when I change it to div, suddenly that applies too. And this also means if I change this, for instance, to a span, that doesn't work because there are no class Bs in this block here that are an immediate child of a span, which is very, very interesting. Now you might be, you know, don't get this mixed up with like a span of class B because that's actually a totally different thing. That's what a span of class B means. So you could actually be even more specific if you wanted to. You could say, give me all divs with class A, then only apply it to the immediate children that are spans of class B. So you can actually join these, you can join the tag selectors and the class ID selectors this way, like this. So span ID B or span class B, you know, very interesting that way. But back onto pseudo-classes. Pseudo-classes are one of those things, you don't use them a lot, but when you do, they're kind of really useful. And probably the most common ones I've seen or will see are button hover, input disabled. They're 2 super, super common ones. Input focus and A visited, you know, they're used as well. I mean, all these things are used somewhere. It's just a question how often. We'll do the A visited one first. So for instance here, if I go back to my CSS file, I will actually add now a new property. So I'll add a pseudo class to the A tag selector called visited. And what this is this is the style to apply if you visited that link before. So in this case here, if I visited this link to Google, then it now comes up as purple, right? This doesn't mean that you've ever visited Google. It means that if you've clicked on that link and visited Google, that's why if you often go back to like, you ever gone back to websites and some of the links are a different color and that's how you know they're the ones you clicked on, or you go to Google and you've Googled something before and you can see what you've Googled. Sometimes I think that's kind of funny when I'm showing someone something and I'm trying to make it seem like I'm just trying to figure it out as I go, but then you see that with students too, right? You'll be like, you'll be like lecturing and there's nothing here, but there'll be a link that's like obviously been clicked on before. And that's because there's a visited pseudo class that's been applied to something somewhere. Again, it doesn't have to be a tag. It can be things like a class. So for instance, like purple visit could be the class name here. So on my A tag, I could say, class equals purple visit. And now it will apply to it based on the class. It doesn't have to be necessarily the tag. We also talked about inputs. So for instance, we have our input up here, our text input. Well, let's give this a class name of say name field like this. I might use a dash to make things a little bit cleaner. So we go dot name field. I know I've got this thing down the bottom. I should probably just use that. So I've got my name field and let's say that, again, my color is blue like this. Okay, so when I type in that's blue, I can pre-populate a value of text that's just whoa. But now let's imagine that the field is disabled. Maybe I want the field to have a different property when it's disabled. So for instance, so here, when it's disabled, I want it to be red, like that. So if we remove the disabled, it is blue. Add the disabled, it's red. Another example of a pseudo class. Definitely, as I said before, probably the most common pseudo class I've come across is the hover. So let's apply a hover to this link, but let's make the link green, for instance. So when you actually move your mouse over it, let's see if we can make it turn a different color. So if we say a hover color green, and I refresh this page, you'll notice that it doesn't change green. In this case, it's probably because this purple visited is overriding it. But if I get rid of that, you'll see that when my mouse moves over it, the Google link turns green. So really, really useful, really handy. That's you'll see that used quite often in terms of removing an underline. So for instance, if text decoration none is to remove an underline. So in this case, moving my mouse over it does that. It's actually used quite often the other way around. So often you'll see people apply text decoration when you put your mouse over it, not the other way. That's been a really common internet trend of the last 10 or 15 years. You'll see most links now, they don't have an underline like they kind of used to until you put your mouse over it, and that's what indicates that it's an actual link. So there are a few different pseudo classes. The focus one is when you've clicked on an input. That'll make more sense when you talk about the events lecture when it comes to learning about the DOM. There's more pseudo classes than that. You can go and play around with them if you'd like. Then we get into an even more obscure area, which is pseudo-elements. Pseudo-elements are when you can create cosmetic content for the element or a specific part of the element. They're really trippy. I haven't used them a ton, but you can see, for instance, you can use this one that's like the first letter is red. This is quite interesting because imagine down here you have a paragraph that's like, hi, how are you? NP like this. I really miss patting your dog. I hope we can eat Thai food. Like that. So we've got a few paragraphs down here. And you know what? I might use the P tag selector in this case and say that it was first letter, wasn't it? Yep. So first letter, color is red. Let's see what this does. So now the first letters of all of those tags are red. Now, obviously, this won't apply to every single HTML element, right? You have elements that are images, and if you apply this kind of, if you apply the pseudo element to the selector to an image, it's just going to ignore it. So these things aren't totally universal, but you can definitely apply them in a lot of scenarios. Then there's another one that's like double. You notice the pseudo elements have two colons, if that wasn't immediately obvious. So just the pseudo classes have one column, but the pseudo elements have two. There's another one here. After the dot text, elements will show a star. Very interesting. So what this means is, like, let's say I want to force full stops at the end of my paragraphs, because it's getting really obscure and fun, right? It's like, I don't want to add them, and I want all my full stops to be like gigantic, or let's just have a bit of fun. So it's like P after. So immediately after, I want there to be a star content. Let's try that first. Okay, now there's a star. Well, let's do the full stop I mentioned. Okay, but you know, let's try and make it really big. Let's make the font size 200 pixels. Okay, so we got a really big not 200 pixels, 500%. So after every paragraph is now a 5 times big full stop at the end. What's the use for this? I haven't figured that out myself yet, but again, point of this is to demonstrate these areas. And this, this is what we want you to think about, because then later on when you see these kinds of double colon things, maybe you'll have a particular problem you want to solve. You go to Google, you go to Stack Overflow, you see these double colons, you're like, what is that? And it's like, oh, I remember, that's a pseudo element. I've never used them, and Hayden sounds like he hadn't used them much, but I'm excited that I can use them, So that's really what this is about. Not a lot to go. We've only got a few more slides left. Cascade. I kind of referenced this earlier, but there's always this question of, like, what happens if you define the same thing twice? So let's say that I have 2 blue texts in my code, and one of them, for some reason, says purple because someone doesn't know what blue is. What is the blue text? These 2 highs here what are they gonna do? Well, they're gonna be blue, right? If I swap these around, they're gonna be purple, or doesn't look like purple to me, but that's okay. I think my screen's red shifted tonight. Yeah, it's purple. So what this means is that the CSS property that's defined is basically the most recently defined one. So the rest of these lecture slides are really focused on, like, in school you learn about order of operations and stuff like that, like which operations come first. It's kind of like this here. What takes precedent? We talk about precedent a lot in computer science, programming, particularly with operations. So it's always the last defined one. And you might think, why in the world would I have 2 blue text classes? Like, what am I trying to solve for here? And the answer is, when you build really big web pages, you're likely to have a large amount of CSS, sometimes across many files. And you know what? Sometimes you will import a file or a library that someone else has made, and they've defined everything: blue text, red text, green text, big text, small text, and you might want to reuse the same name, or you might simply want to override that, and as long as your one was defined most recently, it will apply. Now, the interesting question too is, like, what happens if I make this font size really even bigger? You can see there that doesn't seem to work, but if I move it down here, font size, it should work. Let's try bold text, right? Should work. That's because when they kind of always compose together. So when you define one and a second one after, it's not that the second one kind of throws the first one in the bin and just like replaces it altogether. It only replaces the styles that were defined. So that's something to keep in mind too. It doesn't just delete everything. It just overrides things that already exist. So that's how the cascading works when things are written, when things have the same selector. A much more common thing you're going to see, though, is inheritance. And this is something to really pay attention to. And this makes sense because quite often you'll have something where you say you've got like a block, and that block is defined that everything in it is red. And then inside of that, you might have another span that says everything inside of that is blue, or it doesn't say anything in particular. And the way that CSS works here is that when you define, it's not true for every single property value, but it's true for a lot of the basic styling ones, like, color and size and things like that, is when you define something on the outer element, it will kind of cascade. I don't want to say cascade because we just talked about it. It will be inherited throughout all of the subtags, sorry. So back up here, let's say I want to add another class to this particular div. And by the way, I can add another class just by literally writing it after. I'll call this one bold, for instance. Like that. I can call it bold. This is how you define how you apply 2 classes to the same tag, by the way. So if I come here and say bold and I say font weight is bold, it will now apply to all of those things because all of these spans and this div and this span all inherit it. And if I want to stop that, I have to go and like explicitly define it. So for instance, I might have to say, you know what, all class B's inside of, let's go back up to our top property here. All of class B's, all of span B's inside of div A, I want to have a normal font weight, as in not bold. And you'll see that will now unbold some of them, like that. Now you might be thinking, okay, now I'm really confused because Hayden said before that if we define things later, it should override it or it should come first. That's only true when two selectors are identical. So in this case, dot bold here and this one are different. Now we're going to talk about specificity at the end, but the point is that overriding thing I mentioned only really applies when, it only really applies when you're kind of dealing with things of equal power, so to speak. But again, we'll come back to that in a second. Otherwise, we'll get confused. Point is, things inherit properties like color and weight and stuff all through the tree. And if you would like to change that, you have to explicitly say that. Now, what I just talked about in terms of specificity, that's what specificity, hate that word. One of the strongest things you'll battle with is that quite often an element has multiple rules with the exact same property, and you're not really sure which ones should apply. So we've kind of seen that example here, and I'll move this up the top, where I take my bold and I put it here, and then you think, which one should apply? Because in some ways I've said that everything inside the bold class should be bold. But then here I've said that every B-classed span that is an immediate child of an A-class div should be not bold. So why does one of them win, essentially? You know, which one has more power is what I referred to it before. But there's a little kind of formula-esque thing you can see here, which is that, firstly, there's a general hierarchy, which is very straightforward. Tags have the lowest power, then classes, then IDs, then inline styles. And a really simple example of that is if I come here and I go and make another div, and I'll give it, or maybe I'll make a h3 with an ID of, cat, a class of dog, and an inline style of color red, like this. My title. Now, my title up here is red. That makes sense. If I apply three separate styles, firstly I say, you know what, h3 is going to be color blue. And then I say anything with ID cat is going to be color green. And then I say anything with class dog is going to be color yellow. Now, the inline style always wins, like that. If I get rid of the inline style though, what's going to win? It's going to be the ID. It's going to be green. If I get rid of the ID, it's going to be the class, which is yellow. And if I get rid of the class, it's going to be the tag. So they're your kind of precedence rules when it comes to these like conflicting CSS properties. It's always inline, ID, class, and type. Now, the actual rules are a bit more involved in the sense that like this mathematical thing, I never really use it, but it makes a lot of sense. What I just described makes sense when things are of different type, when there's a tag definition and an ID definition and a class definition, etc. But where things make less sense is if there are two kind of class definitions. So a good example there is like, well, let's say I have my title like this, but let's say we have dog and mouse like that. And then in my styles now, I not only have .dog, but I also have .mouse, and .mouse's color is purple, for instance, right? Now, in this case, it's like, well, let's get rid of this style red because that's overriding it because inline styles always win. And it's like, okay, well, this is green now. Why is it green? Doesn't make a lot of sense, actually. Oh, ID, sorry, yeah, of course. I was like, what? It's confusing. So, you know, it's like, which one should win here? Now, in this case, purple's going to win because the cascading thing, now they're kind of equal. So you can kind of see how this loops back in the sense that there are these specificity rules that help you dictate which should kind of have more authority. But when two things have equal authority, it's always the last one defined. Now, what we're getting at with these rule slides here, with this little kind of numbery thing, is if you do get these kinds of conflicts, the one that wins is typically the one with the most selectors. So this is another type of format you've seen here where what this is saying is that color red should apply to all divs with ID, class 1 and class 2. So similarly here, if this one is that dog is yellow and mouse is purple, if I say anything that has both dog and .mouse, that is purple. Well, that will win, obviously. Let me maybe flip that up here. Anything that is dog and mouse will come first, because when you have that immediate conflict where it's like, okay, well, I have two class definitions, right? I know that classes are less important than IDs, which are less important than inline, but are more important than tags. Well, which one has the most class specificity like that? So that's kind of interesting. And as you can see from the definitions here, it's saying that it's pretty much whichever number is bigger. So in this case here, neither of them have inline styles. In this case, they both have one ID selector that we're looking at here, but one of them has two classes. And this is getting very theoretical now, but let's imagine that our H3 does have an ID that is cat, and let's remove the style for cat. What this is saying is that, you know, putting cat here like this won't change anything. In fact, if I won't change anything like that, but if I get rid of cat on the dog mouse one, then purple wins, because if we go back to the specificity rules, you'll see that ID selectors come further up. So if you were to count if you were to sum up the value of this, there'd be one ID and one mouse, makes it 0, 1, 1, 0, just like this example here. But dog mouse is 0, 0, 2, 0, similar to what's here. So this one would be 0, 0, 2, 0, and this one would be 0, 1, 1, 0. Yeah. Now, I don't want you to get the impression that CSS is super technical and mathematical or anything like that. I never ever think about this. I never code and I'm like, the specificity rules. Because you just don't come across that very often. But why this is a useful exercise is, you know, we're computer scientists. We're here to understand how things work. That's how it works, and now it'll make sense. So even though you'll probably never do that math in your head, not that it's difficult, you'll never sum that up in your head, you at least now understand the underlying mechanics of it, which is really important. And this brings us to the last part here when we're dealing with specificity, which is the exclamation mark important rule. This one is a funny little thing. It's like an anti-pattern in a way. It's like a hack that really can mess things up, but it's like a you know, I don't know, it's like a flamethrower. I'm sure that'd be really useful sometimes, but doesn't mean you should have it. It makes it really hard to figure out. Let me explain it. The exclamation mark important is essentially a way of kind of overriding all of the specificity rules. And that can be useful to hack with, but it can be very bad to make clean code with. And what I mean by that is, let's say we look at something like this. Now, we had all these things before about H3, and we had inline styles, right, where it was color red. And obviously the inline style was going to win, like this, color red was going to win. So let's say I go and put this exclamation mark important now on one of my properties. It will go and override everything else in the specificity chain. So you see that now this is blue. It overrides the IDs, the classes, the inline. It's like a whole extra level. So you imagine you got all these rules here that dictate where things go. And once you put something in with exclamation mark important, it's suddenly more important than all of them. And then you might ask, well, what happens if I put important in multiple places? Well, then you fall kind of back into the old specificity rules here, where it's like, if I go and put important on here, then now it's suddenly purple. And if you want kind of a quick explanation, it's like, well, you basically have, like if you go in order of least important to most important, you have like tag, class, ID, inline, then you have tag important, class important, ID important, and inline important. So you can kind of, that's how I think about it in my head. There's kind of like 8 different layers here. And that's why important's kind of annoying, because you can use it and it solves some problems because you don't have to find out where it is or remember all these rules. And sometimes it's necessary, but it just complicates things because now suddenly everything's like out the window and all the previous, and if you want to then override that, you have to figure out how to make it important further up in the specificity chain. So that's why you'll see the lecture slides are basically just like use with caution. Better to avoid it. It's hard to debug and hard to maintain code, but in a pinch, flamethrower. So that's everything. A quick recap. Most of what we've done here is we learned a little bit about the basic structure of CSS, how to import it. Then we learned a lot about selectors, type selectors, class selectors, ID selectors, attribute selectors, combinators, pseudo-classes, and pseudo-elements. And then we talked a little bit about how kind of conflicts are resolved. So the cascade, when two things kind of have equal power or authority, the inheritance of how things kind of trickle down, the specificity rules of how different types of things take precedence over one another, and then the flamethrower important, that kind of wrecks everything, but is sometimes useful. So thank you. Hopefully that was useful.